Hello and welcome to the Kings Weekly podcast, part of the Basketball Intelligence Network, the Believe Network, and the Old Man Squad Network. I am your co-host, Nick Agar Johnson, editor-in-chief and staff writer for No Ceilings NBA. And I'm here, as always, with my co-host, the founder and curator of the Basketball Intelligence newsletter, available at basketballintelligence.net, Ray LeBeau. Hello there, Ray.
Hello, Nick, and hello, everyone.
So this is going to be pretty much what people might expect for this time of the year. We're going to do a recap of the 2025-2026 season for the Sacramento Kings, which is one of those exercises that, is not maybe going to be, certainly this is not the most fun Kings season to do a season in review for, but just to sort of close the book on the regular season and look ahead to what will hopefully be a positive and important offseason in the history of the Sacramento Kings. But just, for the sake of the exercise, give a brief overview of the season for the Kings. They finished 22-60, which was good enough for 14th in the Western Conference and tied with the Utah Jazz for the 4th/5th best odds, the coin flip that will happen at some point soon. I've not seen any announcement about it.
I think it's April 20th.
April 20th. There we go. Okay, so pretty soon, in the days to come, we will know if the Kings have the 4th or the 5th best odds heading into the lottery. Obviously, neither of those are, what Kings fans might have hoped for as recently as a month ago, but certainly, better position than they could have been, especially given how the stretch run of the season went.
And I would say this.
Go for it.
It's unlikely that in the time between now and April 20th, they're going to be able to find a way to worsen that position.
Yeah. Yes. No, the regular season is over, so they can't make their odds better than they are now, which, is actually a good thing.
I was thinking they can't make it worse like they were doing over the last part of the season.
Well, that's the argument of how are we referring to better or worse, right? It's like the team record is better and the lottery odds are worse. But
okay, yeah.
Anyway, so just some, basic.
The only way you can really do that is to win games,
right? Which the Kings no longer are capable of winning games.
So yeah,
they're not playing anymore. So only so much you can do to lottery odds when you're not playing anymore. But general overview, offensive rating, and all of these numbers are from Basketball Reference, which, some sites calculate these things slightly differently. Certainly Real GM and Basketball Reference and Cleaning the Glass will all end up with different numbers for those. In most part, the Cleaning the Glass one is due to the fact that they take garbage time out of those numbers, which the Kings spent a significant portion of this season in garbage time.
You're not going to rule out 42 minutes a game.
Exactly. Anything after the first, starting out 26-4 is like, okay, so 26 to the Spurs and 4 for the Kings, and I guess the rest of the game's garbage time. No, but the Basketball Reference numbers, which are the ones I have up, they were 26th in offensive rating at a 111.4. They were 28th in defensive rating at a 121.5, leaving them with a net rating of just south of -10, which was 28th in the league. So the expected one loss for the Kings ended up being 19-63. So slightly worse than the record actually ended up being. Just some basic offensive numbers as well. They were 18th in overall field goal percentage, which is dramatically driven by the fact that they were the most 2-point happy team in the league. So they were dead last in 3-point makes, dead last in 3-point attempts, 29th in 3-point percentage, third in 2-point makes, but first in 2-point attempts, which should lead the more mathematically inclined among you to realize, hey, they probably weren't that good at making those twos. And in fact, they were 28th in the league in 2-point makes. They were just at the top of the bottom 10 in free throw percentage at 21st. They were 19th in free throws attempted. Rebounds, they were 22nd in the league, but above average actually in terms of the offensive glass, and then 28th in terms of defensive rebounding, 20th in blocks, 20th in steals. They also were the second worst 3-point defense, which does not surprise Ray in any capacity that opponents shot the nearly 38% from 3-point range against the Kings, which ranked, again, 29th in the league. So a lot of these numbers, along very similar lines of The Kings were not quite the worst team in the league, but they were close in a lot of areas. The
Which means
schedule stuff. Oh,
cumulatively,
go
they
for it.
arguably were the worst because other teams might be one or two slots behind them in one of the categories, but maybe 7 or 8 slots above them in another category.
Yeah, I don't have the numbers for the Wizards up in front of me right
Well, that
now. I
doesn't
know
even
that they
count.
are. I know that they're 30th in a number of the stats that the Kings are 29th in, but maybe not all of them. But
Right, right.
either way, sort of across the board, this wasn't just a, terrible, hapless offense with a decent defense. This was, bottom 5 in both categories. The one sort of ameliorating factor is even though they, for basically the entire second half of the year, they had one of the easiest strength of schedules remaining, they still finished the year with the most difficult strength of schedule. Now, part of that is because they can't play themselves. So, that's always going to be an element in these kinds of numbers. But it wasn't just, they had this awful start to the year and then, things eased up. Things did ease up, but the early part of the schedule was so difficult that even still, even with all of those caveats, they still ended the year with the toughest strength of schedule ranking. So that is a factor in this. But ultimately, when you're looking at team-wide numbers, other than the fact that the Kings were slightly above average offensive rebounding, slightly above average at limiting their own turnovers, pretty much everything else was a waving red flag.
I think the one thing also is worth mentioning is that once they finally decided that they were going to be developmentally oriented and playing the players that should have been playing much earlier, and decided to let them do as well as they could do and actually try to win games. Almost all of those wins came against teams that were begging them to beat them. And so even the 22 win thing is deceptive.
Yeah, I mean, as well, like the Kings were 14 and 50, and then for the rest of the season they went 8 and 10, which is, not exactly world beater, right? But
Especially when you consider who they played.
of course, no, I just mean purely in the sense of at the time when they were 14 and 50 and still had the worst record in the league, you know, the fact that their next game was actually, I think their biggest margin of victory of the season came in their next game where they beat the Chicago Bulls 126-110. And yeah, I mean, if you look at a lot of those wins down the stretch of the season, really other than their win against the Warriors and their completely confounding win against the Raptors on April 1st, which almost felt like an April Fool's joke in and of itself, those were not teams that were trying to win those games.
No, they were
As you
trying to
mentioned,
lose.
they were
Yeah.
desperately trying to hand the Kings a win,
So
and the Kings...
22 wins? No, not really.
Yeah, I mean, again, they 22 and 60 isn't exactly a sparkling record, right? But it's one of those things where it stings slightly less because most of the wins down the stretch of the season were driven by Reno and Cardwell and Dee Clifford and Devin Carter, right? The guys who you would hope are, in theory, going to be parts of the next successful Kings team. But
And the guys that you would have hoped, since this has to be a rebuild and not thinking you're going to win the title or at least make it to the finals this year, should have been playing regular minutes weeks before that.
yeah, well, again, that is the whole conundrum of what exactly was the plan that you and I have talked about on this
Or
here
assuming there
podcast
was a
many a time.
plan. And I'm not sure you're assuming there was a plan, and I'm not sure what led you to that.
Just trying to do good podcasting, just the theoretical concept of they must have had some kind of plan, surely, right? There was some kind of...
You can only decide so many things by coin flip, right?
There you go. So we do want to do some sort of individual player discussions, and we're not going to focus on the rookies because we just did our rookie report series. So if any of you are looking for a more hopeful Kings related episode, this is not the one for you, but the rookie report ones are going to be fun for you to focus
Can I
on. So,
just add a comment on that without going into any of the rookies? Because I always feel the obligation to say this because I think it's sometimes overlooked and it's really fundamentally, extraordinarily true. The Kings have an incredibly good um, player evaluation and scouting staff that has led to, we won't even have to get into any of the details about the rookies, but 3 outstanding rookies when all you had was a 42nd pick. And during the course of the year, picking up Precious, who no other team wanted. And also, I would put Plowden into the mix too. I'm not going to say anything more about them, but I just wanted to reinforce that comment that you and I have both made over and over again.
well, that's actually perfect because they were the first 2 players up that I wanted to talk about. But before we get into those, just to sort of breeze through the players that we need to mention sort of offhand, but don't need to get into that much. And starting with DeAndre Hunter, who played 2 games for the Kings before he was ruled out due to his eye surgery. Numbers aren't that pretty. The sample size is also literally 2 games and 51
Yeah.
minutes. Yeah, it's barely worth talking about. Just mentioning to cover all of our bases. And speaking of mentioning to cover all of our bases, also mentioning the lost seasons that Domantas Sabonis and Keegan Murray had. I mean, they literally did not play a single game together this year, which I think tells a lot of the story of how lost of a season this was for the Kings. But Keegan played 23 games. One of them came off the bench, started all the others. Played 35 minutes a game, which is not entirely surprising given, the complete lack of forward depth that the Kings have. When he was available, he was going to play every possible minute. So, the fact that his steal and block numbers went up pretty significantly without him having a, you know, spike in personal fouls as well, really positive sign. The fact that he only shot 28% from 3-point range is not as positive of a sign. I mean, again, he had such a disjointed year. I don't want to draw too many conclusions from it, but certainly it would have been nice for him to have a better 3-point shooting sample than he did. But, 23 games, not all that much that we can draw from it. Also, he did technically not play for half a season, but there was a significantly larger sample size from Zach LaVine where other than, slight drop offs basically across the board in terms of his offensive stats from the couple months that we saw from him last year after the trade. Really, again, there were a number of things that seemed to work better in terms of the on-court play after LaVine's injury, and part of that is just the younger guys getting to play minutes. Part of that is, the established problems of Zach LaVine as not being a positive defensive presence and in fact really being a pretty significantly negative defensive presence while also not providing much playmaking on the offensive side of things, but being an electric shooter who can get himself open and knock down tons of looks. The flip side of that, of course, is given that he didn't have Sabonis feeding him the ball in the way that he did the last couple months of last season, and also the concerns of him being a lot more hesitant than he should be at times and a lot more willing to let fly than he should be at other times. It was a weird year for LaVine, not a particularly pretty one. Certainly seems all but guaranteed that he'll be picking up his player option for next year because you don't really decline getting $49 million if you have the option to get $49 million. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the offseason with LaVine, but he did still miss more than half the season, unlike DeMar DeRozan, who played all but 5 games, as is the DeMar DeRozan way. And, also as is the DeMar DeRozan way, there were times when the offense was completely helpless without him. There were moments when he really did step up as a playmaker in ways that the Kings didn't have, especially with Sabonis missing most of the year. But also, the point that we've beaten into the ground with DeRozan and also Russell Westbrook, who's up next on the list, is 36 and 37-year-old former All-Stars. It's nice to have future Hall of Famers wearing your team's uniform, but also it's virtually guaranteed that those two will not be part of whatever the next great Kings team is. Now, with DeRozan, he's got a partial guarantee for next year. It'll be interesting to see if there's any trade market for him in the offseason. I would be surprised if the Kings don't at least explore that option. But we'll see how that goes. With Russell Westbrook, I certainly have done as much of a mea culpa as I can, in the sense that I was not expecting him to supplant Dennis Schroeder almost immediately and be a solid starting point guard for the Kings for 2 or 3 months. You, I know, had a slightly less positive take. Certainly the Russell Westbrook from 2026 was a much worse version than the Russell Westbrook of 2025 in terms of play for the Kings. And certainly, as we'll get into with one of the players further down this individual ranking, there were guys who got minutes in March and April that might not have gotten those minutes had Russ finished out the season as an active player. And again, the one positive that I had in terms of my very negative evaluation of him heading into the season was this is a guy who's talked about as one of the superlative teammates in the NBA. So great guy to have in the locker room. His play on the court was a lot better than I expected, but also came with, especially in 2026, the flaws that you associate with Russell Westbrook playing basketball for your team.
Yeah, and I guess my biggest point, and it goes more beyond Westbrook, is do you not know how to rebuild a team? If you don't, why don't you take a look at what some of the other teams have done, like Charlotte or like Oklahoma City or like several of the others who are doing it, not thinking that you can have 40-year-olds starting. That's not rebuilding in my view. And so that's what I guess that was my biggest complaint. Now I will concede that you had to play Russ because you were point guardless. Otherwise, maybe exaggerating it slightly, but
Not really.
yeah. So yeah, but and I would also want to acknowledge what you said in terms of the other things that he brought to the team in terms of, let's just call it mentorship. Um, every other player on the team praises him for that. So that's not fictional. That's real. And so one would hope if the decision is to keep him around, it's for that purpose. And maybe that dictates drafting a point guard. I don't know. Trading for a point guard, or maybe, developing somebody who hasn't shown that they're fully able to be the point guard yet. I don't know, but I think it would be a historic level mistake to have him be the starting point guard next year. And by the end of the year, he was shooting abysmally and turning the ball over on a per minute basis, first in the league. Not good.
Yeah, I mean, I'm less concerned by the turnovers specifically, and a huge part of that is just because as a team, that was the one thing that the Kings actually did a decent job of, was limiting turnovers. And oftentimes, his usage rate was not quite, the 40% that it was that one MVP year for Oklahoma City, but, he did still have the highest usage rate on the team. And part of that is just because somebody's got to have the ball in their hands, right? And if you're the guy who has the ball in his hands.
But his per minute for the season was 29 minutes a game. So to have that many turnovers in 29, that takes effort.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't the prettiest turnover percentage. Certainly among players who got more than 50 minutes, he had the highest turnover rate on the team. So, but I mean, again, that the turnovers weren't as much the problem for the Kings, and therefore that was less of a concern for me.
You don't want that to be part of your rebuild.
Yeah,
I don't think that's a good. And at his age, he's not going to get better.
Yeah. Well, again, the element of having him around in the locker room for the rebuild is maybe
I'm
a
not
good.
opposed to that.
And that's maybe a good.
Other than if it uses up a roster spot that would be used by somebody who's going to contribute on the floor.
Well, and part of that is that, toward the stretch run of the season, the Kings did actually use some players further down their roster and do a little bit of churn at the end of their roster as well. And, the Killian Hayes experiment, I wouldn't say worked out brilliantly. The Patrick Baldwin experiment, I was higher on, but he didn't play much at all. So, up in the air to see how that sort of went. But you teased it earlier, and I do want to get into the three players who fit in the sort of sweet spot of could potentially be part of a rebuild version of the Kings, but also weren't the rookies that we went into depth on pretty recently. So those three, any of you might be able to guess: Devin Carter, Daquan Plowden, and Precious Achiuwa. And
Mm-hmm.
Precious is obviously the big one in terms of pretty much anything you can think of. I mean, he started more than half of this team's games, which, again, if Sabonis was healthy, I think we can agree that was not going to be the case. But even still, he had he had his career high in points for the Kings this year. He had his career high in rebounds this year for the Kings. And for someone who, as you mentioned, right, he'd essentially been thrown on the scrap heap by the NBA. And, for him to sign with the Kings and immediately prove himself as a key rotation player and sort of continue to build on and build on and build on and build on that throughout the course of the year, it's one of those things where I do understand the, more negative fan take that I've seen of, oh, well, this end of the bench veteran, showed out and won a few games for the Kings, and now he's going to move on, and all he did was damage the Kings' lottery position. First of all, I'm not sure it's a foregone conclusion that he's not a member of the Kings next year, although undoubtedly he played himself into more money than veteran minimum contract status.
It appears to be that he wants to stay and the team wants him to stay, and it's up to the two of them, the team and him, to try to figure out if there really is a way that can happen. Is that a fair statement?
I would think that's an absolutely fair statement. And it also brings in the interesting question of I'm trying to find a way to say this that isn't going to be aggregatable, but it does make it more of an interesting discussion when it comes to potential Sabonis trades.
Mm-hmm.
That the Kings essentially picked up three solid 20-minute a game centers over the course of this season,
And
right?
he's only 26.
Yeah, that's the other thing is, Plowden has played 1 year in the NBA, but he's already older than Precious because, Precious came directly out of his freshman year at Memphis to the NBA, and he's bounced around a few times since then, but certainly he's shown that he shouldn't be out of the league by any stretch of the imagination. And the fact that he signed as late as he did, in October, again, speaks well to the Kings scouting department that they realized, hey, this guy shouldn't be, on the scrap heap right now. And he had a great year for the Kings. Certainly credit to him for that. Plowden is another interesting form of discussion in that he was brought in to be a shooter, and for the first couple weeks was shooting like 25% from 3-point range and was still doing enough on defense that he continued to play. And as the season went on, his splits look a lot better in March and April than they did the first few weeks of him playing a regular role for the team. It'll be interesting to see what that looks like. I mean, especially given that Cardwell was converted on his two-way, and much though I had hopes for Patrick Baldwin, it doesn't seem like he's really all that much of an NBA player at this point in his arc. Did get some good minutes for Stockton, back-to-back G League champion Stockton Kings, but not. It certainly seems like there will be room for Plowden to come back on another two-way contract next year, and who knows, potentially earn his way into something larger.
And
Especially, go for it.
I just would want people to think about how significant it is to have a strong bench. I mean, maybe that's obvious, but I don't think it is. There's a lot of fans that look at teams and really just focus on their stars or their starters, um, maybe down to rotation players. But a player like Plowden coming off your bench to me is a plus.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a very specific thing with the Kings in particular because the strength of the Beam team was that they had the best starting lineup in the league. And they had Trey Lyles sometimes off the bench, and that was pretty much it. The days of Alex Len being the backup center and being better than the other candidates at backup center, we're past those days in terms of team record, not a positive way, obviously. But yeah, this team is no longer, we have an incredible starting lineup and we need our bench to just not lose minutes because,
Isn't that remarkable when you think about the fact that they had no injuries that year and still didn't have a bench?
well, I'm not sure how much that says about the team building and how much that says about Mike Brown and how much that, there's a whole weird morass, but
True, true.
certainly the picture perfect starting lineup is no more and has
But if
not
you
been.
have if you have 65 games lost to injury and you still don't have a bench, you at least think that's really strange.
Yeah, no, again, that team was more of an outlier than I wanted to admit at the time, and even in hindsight, more than I want to admit. But them being as healthy as they were certainly meant that their lack of depth was not exposed in a way that it is for most teams. But I do want to talk about one more individual player season before we move on to the remaining segments we have here today. And that is Devin Carter, who a few weeks ago I brought up that he had played more minutes in his last 7 games than he had in his entire NBA career up to that point. But with Devin Carter, there's a very obvious delineating line of the All Star break in terms of, how consistently he got to play, when he got to play, what kinds of lineups he was allowed to play in, et cetera, et cetera. And it is no surprise to me at all that his shooting splits pre and post All-Star break seem like two completely different players. I mean, 39% from the field and 19% from three-point range pre All-Star break. He played 20 games before the All-Star break. He played 18 games after the All-Star break, but 11 of those 18 games were starts. He played significantly more minutes in fewer games after the All-Star break than he did before, and unsurprisingly, he looked a lot better for it because his minutes were consistent and his role was consistent, and all of those sorts of things that a few years ago we talked about with Kevin Herter of how things seemed very weird after he was removed from the starting lineup and didn't ever figure it out again in a Kings uniform. The thing with Carter that is most concerning to me, honestly, it's not even the shooting stuff, which, again, even with the 32% post All-Star break, that's still not fantastic, and he still finished the year at 26%. Again, not sparkling performance in terms of his shooting. The fact that he is not enough of a pure point guard to be the starting point guard is something that you and I have been talking about since at least summer league, but before then as well, with his sort of disjointed weird stretch when he came back way too early from his injury last season and clearly couldn't shoot, clearly wasn't right. He had that shoulder wrap from the moment he played last season through us seeing him in summer league. So, a bit easier for me to discount last year as a lost season. This year, he did show a lot of flashes of good stuff. Certainly, the defense was exactly as good as you could have hoped for, but it is telling to me that we are continually having the discussion of the Kings need a point guard, the Kings need a point guard, the Kings need a point guard with Devin Carter on the roster.
I still think he's got the potential to be a quite valuable player, even though he might not fit their number one need. It's good that he's past what caused most of the deficiencies by coming back early. Um, I wish that, as I do for a number of the other players on the team, that they'd given him more on-court developmental time earlier. Look, even at the very, very end of the league, how he was scoring. I'm of the very, very end of the league schedule, how he was scoring. I think there's significant hope. I'm not disagreeing with you in terms of positionally, but I think somebody that has his abilities, whether it's defense or rebounding or scoring necessarily, maybe not necessarily on a pure percentage basis, you'll find a spot for him, I think. And I think he'll grow into that. That's my impression.
No, I think he's a valuable rotation player. I think it's just
He's not the
also,
starting point guard. Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
important to point out that even though I think he is a valuable rotation player who should be a bigger part of the Kings' plans going forward, more like the post All-Star break stretch than the pre All-Star break stretch. Again, I mean, that was part of my concern with him heading into the draft was he's pure point guard sized, but with the shooting guard skill set. And the Kings have quite a few players on the roster who are point guard sized with a shooting guard skill set.
There is some redundancy.
So before we wrap up, just, we've talked about the players, we've talked about the team as a whole, but we haven't hit on the coaching or the front office side of things. So, year 1.5 for Doug Christie at this point. And Ray, I know you had some things you wanted to say about the Christie experience here and some of what we've heard since the end of the season from Christie's side of things.
And I still hold to what my position has been, although I'm not sure I've said it as fairly as I could. And I watched his season-ending video conference, and I was quite impressed with what I've already been impressed with, his personality and character, his general intellect, and his basketball IQ. He gave very insightful and interesting, mostly answers to things. And so I'm holding to my view. I want to say it better, I guess, because I do think he brings a lot to the team in terms of, let's just use an encapsulated word rather than go into all the details that we do in leadership. I think he's really excellent in that. Everybody knows what my position is, and I'm pretty sure it's what everybody else's position is this year. He got out coached in every single game. And I think it's important to stress none of that is his fault from my perspective. He's deposited into a situation where he's up against more experienced head coaches every single game that come from much better backgrounds than he came from in terms of being on the bench with whether it's Eric Spoelstra or Pop or whoever, and many more years and sometimes in many different contexts. And here he is, in a very limited time, in a strange situation, to come in and be expected to not necessarily outcoach, but at least similarly coach a team. That in virtually every second half, the other team is much more successful in making adjustments. I'll just use that as a shorthand. And I think it's been very unfair to him, and the expectations have been unfair to him. I do want to say I like him, and I think he brings a lot to the team, but I think it's, as we say about the team generally over the last however long, it's a really bad fit, and it's a really disservice to him to ask him at this point in his career to be able to, whether it's adjustments or strategy or tactics or counters or whatever you want to say, to expect him to be able to successfully coach against almost all the other coaches in the league.
I think multiple things can be true at once, which is sort of where I settle on this, which is the fact that he went 27 and 24 last year, to me, speaks to the positives of Doug Christie as a coach. Namely, he came in as head coach after, we don't need to beat around the bush with it. Mike Brown had clearly lost the locker room.
But wasn't he 9-1 at one point? So that's 18. And I mean, that's 18 and what? I mean, 2017-24 to me is a little deceptive because I think that initial burst that he had was a function of Mike being gone and him being there, and the rest of the season spoke more loudly to me.
I mean, that's fair. I don't disagree with that notion.
So it's 18 and
Just
23 or something like that.
yeah, for the record, he didn't start 9-1.
Whatever.
He started let me just do some 7-2. So seven
Okay.
and one, I guess,
All
was
right, 7-1.
yeah, because he lost his first game and then won the next
Yeah.
seven.
Okay, so
And
now you're talking about 20 and 23.
which, it's still pretty decent. I mean, especially
I
given
mean,
where the
we would have been
team.
glad to have that this year.
Yeah, exactly. And so again, that stretch alone speaks to, okay, clearly there was some element of leadership, of locker room cohesion that the previous head coach had not managed to maintain, hold on to, that Doug Christie did. And that's a point in his favor. And I don't want to elide that. I'm slightly, what's the right way of putting this? I'm slightly less optimistic because of some of the adjustment stuff that you mentioned, which I just keep going back to the fact that Mike Woodson is his associate head coach, right? It's not like there's nobody on that bench who has experience with leading NBA teams, with being a head coach in multiple different locations, right? I mean, the rest of his bench, I mean, Mike Miller is a developmental coach who's been around forever and ever and ever. Bobby Jackson, been around the league for a very long time. Leandro Barbosa, more recent, certainly, but, has been on, I mean, he was on the Warriors staff, right? He's someone who has experience with a slightly higher level staff than what Doug Christie has
So
been a
are
part
you
of.
saying it sounds like I'm kind of making an excuse because he had the people there who could give him the requisite degree of guidance that he needed?
It's that, and it's also the fact I just can't get over the fact that the Kings were 29th in 3-point percentage allowed and 27th in 2-point percentage allowed. It's like your defensive scheme should be limiting at least one of the two most efficient kind of shots there is, right? It's like if yes, the most efficient shot is shooting free throws, right? And the Kings, they were not bottom of the league in terms of free throws allowed. They were actually higher up there than you would like. Opponents, they were 23rd in the league in terms of opponent free throws allowed. But again, what it gets back to for me is if you're allowing open 3-pointers because you're packing the paint and that's your strategy to deal with having Domantas Sabonis as your center, fine. If, it's not fantastic, but, as Mike Brown showed, the Kings in the past have been able to not get away with, but survive terrible 3-point defense by packing the paint. The fact that this year's Kings did neither of those two things really concerns me. The fact that, as you mentioned, again, nowhere near as bad as the Luke Walton experience, but certainly pretty close in terms of it's the third quarter, the Kings are up by 3, and the default assumption is what adjustment are they going to make that the Kings aren't, right? It's like, how are they going to screw this up every time? And that's, when the Kings were, the rare occasions that the Kings are heading into halftime with a lead, it would still be the default assumption was, okay, how are they going to blow this? The locker room leadership stuff, the ego management, all of that, it's a very important part of coaching. I don't mean to understate that by any stretch of the imagination, but also that's just not enough on its own.
I'm going to agree and slightly disagree and mostly agree. I mean, I think that whatever one makes of the situation, and I don't think we see it all that differently, pretty much the same, that is not likely to change significantly enough in a period and that um, matters for him to still be in this position. In fact, I would argue that with the excellent qualities that he does have, plus his intelligence and his basketball IQ, if he were to spend 3 or 4 years under one of the best coaches in the league, he might be able to come back and not be who he is now.
Sure, that's completely fair. The problem is that's not what's happening.
No, I understand. I'm agreeing with you to that extent. And I've said that all year, right? And it's just like it's hard to watch. And even in the post game shows, over and over again, I would hear them say the league doesn't have a rule against making adjustments. If the other team can do it, why can't the Kings?
Speaking of over and over and over again, let's move to talking about the front office.
Okay, I'm still kind of in the position of, is it that there is no plan or is it that there's a bad plan?
And that's not a place you want to be in.
And, I listened to Scott talk at his conference, and I realized that, you're not going to share too much in terms of stuff that's proprietary and what your plans are and who you're thinking about drafting. Probably you're not even allowed to say some of that. And it's not talking about the draft, but just in general. But he seemed to be quite comfortable with the, what do you call them, veteran plus 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 players are going to be part of the team next year. Although we kind of hinted maybe, yeah, there are ways that might change. But boy, he was sure talking like, yeah, we really like them and they're really good.
I mean, we don't need to belabor the point too much, but there have been discussions among, let's just say, high ranking Kings personnel about how there were some people with power in the situation who believed that the Kings were just bit by the injury bug. And that was all that happened this year. And that, oh, if only there hadn't been all those injuries, we would have been competing for the playoffs just like everybody else. And
What's funny to me about it is all the other teams that had at least as significant injuries and still are playing.
yeah, I mean, there's a team that the not so subtly aforementioned authority figure within the Kings has been associated with in the past that won 15 more games than the Kings and is still currently in play-in contention.
And
And
probably missed Steph Curry at least a little bit.
I would say that wasn't the best for their, game
And
winning
anybody that saw
prowess.
Draymond last night, holy expletive.
Yeah. No, I mean, again, like we're beating around the bush with a lot of this, but ultimately where I'm at with some of the front office stuff is the only read of some of these things that makes any sense to me is if Scott Perry is not speaking to the Kings fan base, but rather to one very specific person within Kings world who, controls the purse strings, to put it that way.
Yeah, I'm kind of at a loss because I, I I had a hard time following conceptually as a conceptual package the various things that he said. They didn't seem to be consistent with each other. He said a lot of different things. And okay, so you're planning to do what? Or your philosophy is what? Or it was hard. It was really difficult to follow in a way that it made sense as a composite.
And, you've mentioned this before. I'm sure you'll mention it again, but he went back to his favorite 6 talking points that pretty much nobody can object to. That is
Well, the
just
six
about,
pillars, well, as you point out, how are you going to object to them? Who wouldn't want accountability? Who wouldn't want discipline? Who wouldn't want toughness? On and on. And if you think about it, unless there's somebody that we're not even aware of that's a general manager, I bet you would have an impossible time finding any GM that would say, "Oh yeah, those are the six. Those are six of the most important, if not the most important things." I mean, they're so generic, right? And they're so obviously correct. What do they mean?
I think they mean, I don't want criticism, so here's what I'm saying we're looking for.
How? No, I don't want anybody that's accountable. No, I don't want anybody that's tough. No, I don't want anybody that's disciplined. No, I don't want anybody that communicates. You don't? Why?
There's also the cynical side of me that's saying, oh, so you're bringing up things that unless you're a media member actively covering the team, you're going to have no idea about, right? It's like you can see toughness on the court, but it's like, I guess we're just taking Scott Perry at his word that every player he signs is accountable and that they're trustworthy. It's like, what basis is there for any of
And
that
why
other than,
wouldn't you want that? Anyway, I mean, I'm not disagreeing with your point, but who would make a counter argument?
yeah, nobody. And I think that's the whole point.
Right?
So before we wrap up, just doing another round of song lyrics and titles. So Ray,
Yeah,
do you want me to go first?
up to you.
I'll go first just because I have mine up. So
Okay.
for this week, we went with a song title and song lyrics, and I sort of cheated, but I'm perfectly fine with it because I think it's the most valid response. I chose AC/DC's "Highway to Hell," and the lyric, of course, being "I'm on the highway to hell." Which, hey,
So,
welcome back to basketball hell, right here in Sacramento.
so my picks for song title, and don't ask me for the artist because there were multiple of this, and I don't know which one I'm going to choose. But glad it's over. It's like, that's that. Yes, that's my perspective right now. And my song lyric is from Pete Seeger's "Where Have All the Flowers Gone," and the line is, "When will they ever learn? When will they ever learn?"
Yeah, no, it's a more musically lyrical version of, I mean, this has been attributed to many people, but the one that I know of it being attributed to the most is Albert Einstein of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results.
Yeah.
And on that happy-go-lucky, cheery note, that's kind of do it for us for this episode. So we will have a few more episodes, certainly between now and the NBA draft. We'll have some idea in a couple weeks of where the Kings end up. We'll have even more of an idea, as you already mentioned, early next week after the coin flip, and we'll see where the lottery odds end up. But again, we will have some coverage of the situation and all of the lottery stuff heading up to the lottery and the draft itself. And knowing us, I have every reason to believe that we will have plenty of post-draft breakdown coverage of whoever the Kings end up with on draft night. But again, that's going to do it for us today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. If you're listening to the podcast, please be sure to subscribe, leave a rating and a review in whatever podcast player you might be using. 5 stars, always much appreciated on our end. If you're checking us out on YouTube, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Again, as mentioned up top, we are part of the Basketball Intelligence Network, which you can find on social media at Ticket Rules. We are part of the Believe Network, which you can find on social media at Believe, BLEAV. And we're also part of the Old Man Squad Network, which you can find on social media at Old Man Squad. You can find Ray and I on social media at Ray LeBove on Twitter, for Ray at Ray Rael on Blue Sky. You can find me at NBA Johnson on both those platforms. And you can find Kings Weekly Pod at Kings Weekly Pod on Twitter, at Kings Weekly Podcast on Blue Sky. And if you've been enjoying the show, in addition to the feedback mentioned previously, feel free to reach out to us via email, kingsweeklypodcast@gmail.com. And as always, thanks so much for listening.